Earlier in the program, we focused on specific microskills for helping. In this session, I'd like to take a look at more general guidelines for listening and helping that can help us in our work with the people we're caring for. Also to take a look at some of the common myths and mistakes that can cause problems for us as helpers and for the people we're caring for. Some of the guidelines for listening that I find most useful to us as helpers are these: to enhance self-esteem, to suspend judgments, to resist outside distractions, to recall content as we listen, to create two-way intimacy via self-disclosure, to develop a wide range of helping responses, and to help people tell their stories. The first of these, enhancing self-esteem, is, I think, at the core of our work as helpers. Whenever I enter any situation as a helper, whether it's with an individual or with a family, I like to have like a bright light shining and flashing for me, and that is enhance self-esteem. Because if I do that, I'm very likely to be successful as a helper. I think the law of self-esteem management is akin to the law of gravity in the physical sciences. We have, it's that powerful in interpersonal relations. In any interaction, the self-esteem management and self-esteem issues are at the core of what's going on. And ask yourself, have you ever wanted to be in the presence of somebody in whose presence your self-esteem went down even one notch? Probably not likely. So what we have to do as helpers is help people talk about themselves and overcome what I call the distress disclosure dilemma, which is the dilemma that if I talk about my distress and reveal some of my difficult feelings and my anger and my hurt and all these other things, will other people feel good about me? So the person we're talking to is always grappling with that. And what we must do is help them self-disclose while at the same time enhancing their self-esteem. I think it's very helpful to emphasize something positive that the person is doing and coping with this situation. I always find it, in talking with bereaved individuals, useful to comment on just how much they cared about the person they've lost, and that this feels good, and it also is true, and it's sad, but it's very true, and it helps people feel better about themselves. Always look for something positive that you can emphasize about how people are coping with these difficult situations.
I think when you talk, you can solve a lot of things when you can talk to each other.
Well, I really admire and respect how you guys have really found a way to talk to each other.
We really have. We never did that before, but boy, this has brought something out of it.
It changes your life a lot. You know, you can lose a mother, father.
Death brings us really close to each other.
I'm really glad that that's been happening for you.
Yeah. Well, yeah.
I'm happy that that's happening for you, that you're being closer with people and that you're able to talk about it. I think that's a real gift to be able to do that, because these are very difficult feelings that need to be talked about. It sounds like, you know, that to have somebody who can share with you and be there for you is real important, and you've been able to do that. One sure way to not enhance self-esteem in the people we're caring for is to be judgmental. And that's the first guideline I'd like to talk about now, which is we need to suspend our judgments while we're helping people. We need to allow what they're talking about to sink in and to think about it without letting our own values come in and wreak havoc. Because you're always helping people that in some way you may disagree with on different points and have different values. And it's important to really allow their message to sink in without letting all this stuff get in the way. It's important as helpers to resist outside distractions. I like to say good helpers develop big ears, big eyes, and a small mouth. Now, I'm not advocating passivity. I'm advocating a very active, involved style as a helper. But at the same time, we need to really pay attention to what someone's saying, to really listen, and to have that be the entire thrust of what we're doing. Communicate in every way possible. I am listening to you. I am focused on you. That in itself really enhances self-esteem for someone to feel that they are worth listening to. So you're really doing something very profound when you simply pay attention to someone and listen to them. The next guideline is to recall content. And it's very important that you can remember what someone has said to you and that you don't allow someone to just go on and on and on for so long that you don't have any idea what they've said and you're only going to respond to a very small part of the message. So it's important in a way to kind of play dumb and say, hey, let's see, what are you saying here? Go back to the beginning, reset and say, let me see if I'm getting this right. Because if somebody goes on for a long time, you're not going to really communicate about most of the message. So stop people and say, hey, let me see if I'm getting this right. What is this about here? Recall content as you listen. The next guideline is to create two-way intimacy via self-disclosure. And I've talked a little bit about this earlier in the program. This is a very complicated issue. And I think we have here one of the key issues between professional helping and volunteer helping as well, and friendship. In friendship, you share something, I share something, and we reciprocate back and forth. But in a helping relationship, that's not what's occurring. What we need to do in a helping relationship is think before we self-disclose, how will this be of help to the person I'm talking with? How could this be useful? And I think when we've had similar experiences, for example, and we make what we call Me Too self-disclosures. Yeah, I've been there, I've had that same kind of experience. I lost my sister, or some other experience that's similar to what they've encountered. The important thing there is not that we say, oh yeah, I understand, but that we communicate our understanding. It's no use to say, oh, I understand, I've been there, unless we can really communicate that we do in fact understand, that our experience has given us additional empathy that then we communicate and respond to the subtleties and the uniqueness of their experience. In fact, I think that sometimes having similar experiences to the people we're caring for can really get in the way of real empathy because we project our own experiences into theirs. Another guideline is to develop a wide range of helping responses. I've been arguing throughout the series that we need to increase our repertoire of helping skills. We need to really give less advice, ask fewer questions, do more paraphrases, more reflection of feelings, more self-disclosures, to move toward a style of counseling that's less directive, so that we are able to really accomplish what I consider maybe the most important guideline for helping, which is to help people tell their stories. What we have to do is avoid communicating, I know where you're going, let me take you there. The real message we want to communicate is, I don't know where we're going, but I have some idea of how to get there. So this is an important difference. And the idea here is that if we can help people tell us their story, we will have gone a long way toward being an effective helper. You really have to check out everything with the person. Really listen. Really never think you know more about the people you're helping than they know about themselves. Henry Nouwen wrote about this beautifully in a passage from Monastic Studies. He wrote, "The counselor is the student who wants to learn. The counselee is the teacher who wants to teach his story. Just as the teacher learns his own material best because he has to prepare himself and order his ideas for presentation to his students, so the counselee learns his own story by telling it in an ordered way to his counselor who wants to hear it. The counselor is the host who patiently and carefully listens to the story of the stranger. The counselee is the guest who rediscovers his own self by telling his story to the one who offered him a place to stay. And in the telling of the story, the stranger befriends not only his host, but also his own history." I think this is a beautiful description of the process of helping and what we should strive for in our work with the people we're caring for. We've talked a lot about what good helping is, but let's take a few moments and look at what it is not. I refer to some of the behaviors I'm going to talk about in this segment as psychonoxious or psychotoxic. They cause real problems for us as helpers. I think one of the most dangerous myths we can have as a helper is that we don't make mistakes. We do make mistakes. We're not flexible enough when we should be more flexible. We don't listen enough when we should be listening more, etc. We make mistakes constantly. It's important that we realize this and we accept it. We will very often say the wrong thing, which reminds me of a story from my own life. I was in Tahoe. My parents were visiting when I was in graduate school, and I was out gambling. They were back at the hotel. My mother became worried, and she was, Dale's not back at the hotel yet. And she woke up my father, who was sleeping, and said, Don, Dale's out there. This is kind of a dangerous place, all this gambling and everything. Maybe you should go out and look for him. Somebody could have hit him on the head and taken his wallet. My father, very groggily, said, geez, if I go out there, somebody could hit me on the head and take my wallet. My mother looked at him and said, well, leave your wallet. Now, this is true, and they looked at each other and laughed, and my mother realized what she had said, but we often say things we can't believe as helpers. We asked some of the experienced helpers in our group what mistakes they had made and what they had learned not to do. This is what they said.
They don't need to hear it. Let's get on with it. You know,
That's got to be the worst.
they're gone now. They suffered a long time. Now you should get on with your life. Forget about their pain.
They also don't need to hear they're better off now.
Oh yeah.
Or this was God's will.
Or God loves you very much. And then I just don't think people of faith realize that God loves them, but I think in a time of grief you don't want to hear that.
Or be brave.
Yeah.
Because they have the right to cry at this time. They have the right to feel. Or you shouldn't feel that way. You don't feel that way.
Negating their feelings.
One of the phrases I've heard a lot is, this is your cross now, you know, you have to carry it, kind of thing.
Prejudging where they are, and I have to watch that I don't, in my own mind, prejudge where people are, because that affects how we minister to them. Try to have an open mind.
And the thing is, time heals everything. Time will heal everything, you know. You'll be all right.
The advice, too, any kind of advice. They don't need advice. They don't need to be helped along the way with decision making.
Another one is, I know what you're feeling. You really don't.
Or don't cry. You'll only make yourself sick.
One myth about how people cope with grief that can cause real problems in the helping relationship is the belief that grieving people will get over their grief in a specified period of time, that they will reach a state of resolution of their grief, and that they will recover in this relatively short period of time. Authors write that grief is a process, recovery is a choice. Resolution, recovery, reestablishment, reorganization, all these things imply a return to normalcy, when in fact the research shows that many people don't have this kind of experience. Distress related to grief can continue for many years, and it's common for there never to be any real resolution of the grief experience. On the other hand, many people don't show the normal reactions of grief. They don't have the normal symptoms of grief. In both cases, there's a kind of collision between the social expectations and the inner experience of the grieving individual. And this can lead to grieving people being critical themselves. I shouldn't be having these feelings, or I should be having these feelings. I'm not coping very well. And then to hide this distress, or the lack of distress, from the people around them, family and us, the helpers. Almost half of the people who have suffered major traumas do not experience intense anxiety. This is a recent finding in the research literature. They don't have intense anxiety, depression, or grief after the loss. These are kind of roll with the punches people. About 18% of people we find are chronic grievers. They have distress and depression continuing unabated for months or years. About 30% follow the stages that I've outlined earlier. They go through a period of suffering and then greater relief. And about 2% are what are called delayed grievers. They experience it later on.
I keep thinking back at people telling me, oh,
it gets easier as it goes on.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm finding it more difficult as it goes on.
And that's a surprise, isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah.
I can't understand that. Why is it more difficult as it goes along?
Mm-hmm.
But I don't know, that the space of time changes in my mind. Sometimes it seems like it's been 10 years since I've
Mm-hmm.
seen her and smiled at her and held her in my arms and talked to her.
Mm-hmm.
I miss that.
That's what you miss.
Yes. And other times it seems like, well, she really hasn't been gone that long.
Mm-hmm. The myth and the expectation that people should be over their grief or should be resolved in their grief within a specified period of time leads to some problematic kinds of issues for us as helpers in our interventions with grieving individuals. One of the very difficult things that happens is that we tend to trivialize the distress of the people we're caring for. Dick Lazarus has described this as a process in which we under-respond to the distress of the grieving person. What we do when we do this is supported by various factors in our culture and in us as individuals, and I'd like to talk about these. The first is that in our society, suffering is seen as a waste of time. It's a needless imposition on one's life. We have writers talking about the hero's journey, grief, working through effectively, the courage to grieve. I can see the ad now. Through Dianetics, you're able to process your grief more effectively and move on and make more money. We have one psychologist talking about power grieving. You can see the theme here. The bottom line is that we don't respond adequately to the actual distress people are experiencing. We've reached a point in history where what is usually prescribed is to not grieve. And the myth that people should resolve their grief in a relatively short period of time supports this trivialization of distress. Another factor supports trivialization of distress, and this is that at this point in history we're on what I call the threats to challenges bandwagon. There's a view that it's better in any stressful situation for us to see it as challenging rather than as threatening, which is true from a strict stress theory point of view. It's always better to see things as challenges. Then we become stress hardy and we're able to deal with things rather than regressing to more ineffective coping strategies. However, when we're talking about the awful, tragic stressors in this situation, there often is no redeeming value. We're not talking about a traffic jam, should we see it as a threat or a challenge. We're talking about losing your child. And I think we can see this also in our responses to cancer patients and other people who are victimized with different illnesses and traumas in life, that we tend to say, be challenged. But if I lose my leg, don't tell me, be challenged, go climb a mountain like the X on the TV. And I think this is a great problem, and that we tend to, in the context of trying to encourage hope and promoting a positive outlook, which is the third contributing factor, to encourage people to be positive, to think positively. We want people to feel better. We know that feeling good about things helps people cope more effectively. But at the same time, when we don't listen to the distress, it can be very counterproductive. And there's another factor contributing, which is that we have, as human beings, an unconscious desire to not encounter so much distress ourselves. It's painful. It's painful to sit with a mother and talk with her about losing her child. It's very hard. It'd be nice if she had resolved this grief a little bit and could be focused on the positive things happening in her life and start to make some movement to sit and talk about her depression and her feeling of hopelessness and not wanting to go on, and talk about all these difficult experiences with us is very painful. So we have a kind of interpersonal allergy, an emotional button that gets triggered in us. And when this happens, we tend to move away on the continuum of emotional involvement. We tend to back up, and we tend to say, hey, think positively, and some very counterproductive things come out of our mouths. My recommendation to you as a helper is pretty simple. Don't think that the goal is to get over the grief. We really never get over our grief. We more become reconciled to it. You just can't inject a positive attitude in these situations. But you have to sit and listen for that forward moving edge of the person's experience. You have to water the new life in their experience. And learn what grief and grief's timetable are for this particular individual. And expand your concept of the variability of normal grief. It's enormous variability. Now, the belief that everybody should have the kinds of grief experiences that we're most familiar with, the depression and the extreme stress, also leads to problems in our responses, because then we have people who are more of the roll with the punches kind of people, and we are over-responding to their distress. We're saying, well, this could be delayed grief, this could be problematic, this could be denial, and really, in fact, they're just rolling with the punches. So in this case, what we have to do is follow the motto of don't scratch where it doesn't itch. I want to conclude with some suggestions, some things to remember. It's okay to not know what to say. Be there. The smallest deed is better than the grandest intention. Henry Nouwen's written beautifully about the difference between 0 and 1. Just human presence alone is a powerful healing factor. So your presence alone is doing something. Don't underestimate it. Be sensitive. In all of your actions, communicate, I care about you. I care about you. Have that come through. Respect people's defenses. Emphasize that this is one way they take care of and preserve themselves in your own mind and maybe in your communications with them. That's how you're taking care of yourself. When they're saying, I'm going crazy, I'm doing these crazy things, or I'm not able to look at that, that's fine. That's how you're taking care of yourself. And that also enhances self-esteem. Practice the art of the possible. You can't meet every need. Anything you do is more than nothing, and you often don't know what the positive effects are of some of your interventions, because people aren't going to call you up 6 months later and say, oh, that phone call was very important, but it was. So if you make one phone call, that's better than nothing. And when you start thinking about what you're doing and saying, oh gosh, I wasn't able to do this, I wasn't able to do that, I wasn't able to do that, think of what Adolf Meyer once said to his trainees. He said, in your profession, you'll often be tempted to play the role of God, and so few of you have the qualifications.